McGraw-Hill, Living with Art, 13th edition, Part 2, Chapter 5, Principles of Design. Chapter outline: Unity and variety, balance, emphasis and subordination, scale and proportion, rhythm, elements and principles, formal analysis. Let's start with unity and variety. Artists create visual unity through repetition. The first thing that strikes us when we look at this work by Toulouse-Lautrec is the repetition of similar curving shapes in gray and black, musical instruments, arms, elbows, and letters. This repetition unifies the composition, typing the parts together. At the same time, we also see that not everything in the image is black or gray. There are different colors. The purse, stage, chair, cane, and the gentleman's hair are yellow. The middle woman's hair is orange and her lips are red. These colors add variety and make this poster more visually interesting. Yet, by using so many yellow objects, the artist unifies the work as well. Toulouse-Lautrec got the idea for this composition by observing people at the theater. But when he translated what he saw into a work of art, he imposed his artistic vision by repeating shapes and contrasting colors. He understood that this unity and variety in the composition made the image work better and helped the poster to engage his viewers. The unity of Tina Moditti's photograph, Stairs, is easy to see. Rectangles and triangles abound. Each step, railing, and plank of wood is a rectangle. Each corner and intersection of the two stairs or planks forms a triangular shape. The repetition of these shapes unify the composition. The monochromatic array of gray values ties the work together as well. Still, the photograph has lots of variety. The direction of rectangles changes from the second story, where the photograph is taken, to the top section of stairs, the landing, and the lower section of stairs. There is also a strong diagonal created by the brightly lit crossbar within the second story railing. Looking closely reveals that the texture difference in each section, from the scuffled wood stairs to the smooth wall. Each of these elements adds variety and makes the image more interesting. Unity and variety apply to three-dimensional art as well. At first glance, the seated figures in Magdalena Abakanowitz's 80 Backs look identical. They are all the same size and have the same brown hue with identical value. Their headless bodies repeat from one to the next, back bent and turned to the viewer, legs folded in front, arms drawn tight to the body. Installed in galleries or outdoors, the 80 backs appear together in groups, sometimes in rows and sometimes in loose clusters, but all facing the same direction. We are meant to see their oneness and their unity as a crowd. Unity in a work of art can be conceptual, involving the ideas underlying the forms. The three works of art we have just considered demonstrate visual unity and variety based on the elements of shape, line, and color. Art can also be unified conceptually. That is, it can be unified through the unity of ideas, such as in Enrique Chagoya's Uprising of the Spirit. This piece is unified through the concepts of heroism and cultural interaction. This large painting features the 20th century American superhero, Superman, battling against the ancient Mexican ruler who carries a feather shield. Below Superman is a scene of European colonizers committing atrocities against the Native Americans. Chagoya appropriated this image. The ruler came from a 16th century Mexican manuscript, Superman from a popular comic book, and the scene of the atrocities from the 16th century European print. These disparate elements are unified conceptually by the artist's critique of colonialism and his reflection on his own heritage as a Mexican-American artist who was raised with both Mexican and American cultural influences. By having a modern-day American superhero square off against an ancient Mexican ruler, Chagoya brings us into the contemporary era and references 21st century political and social issues. Unity and variety. Unity in a work of art can be conceptual, involving ideas underlying the form. Using any of the visual elements, artists introduce variety to make the work more interesting. Using any of the visual elements, artists introduce variety to make their work more interesting. As in this work by Abakanowitz, where we see much unity in the figures, she also introduces variety. While all of the figures are molded from resin-soaked burlap and look identical, they are not all the same. Looking carefully, we can see variety in the folds and lumps on the back and in the texture change from the figure to figure. The hunched shoulders and bent backs have slightly different masses. Even the seemingly monotonous installation has variety, with differences in spacing between the figures and slight variations in directions. Not only does this variety add visual interest to the work, but it also reminds us that even within a group sharing a moment of ritual, that we are still individuals. Balance is the arrangement of areas of visual weight within a work of art. Balance is the arrangement of areas of visual weight within a work of art. What looks heavy and what looks light? The only possible answer is that depends. We do not perceive absolutes but relationships. The heaviness or lightness of any form varies depending on its size in relation to the sizes of forms around it, its color in relation to the colors around it, and its placement and composition in relation to the placement of other forms. The drawing here illustrates some very general precepts about asymmetrical or informal balance. In the first slide, we see a large form is visually heavier than a small form. In the second, a dark value form is visually heavier than a light value form of the same size. In the third, a textured form is visually heavier than a smooth form of the same size. And in the fourth example, a complex form is visually heavier than a simple form of the same size. And in the fifth, we see two or more small forms can balance one larger form, while in the last one, we see a small dark form can balance a larger light one. Symmetrical balance, with visual weight equally distributed across an axis, may be horizontal or vertical. Symmetrical balance with visual weight equally distributed across an axis may be horizontal or vertical. In Haruka Kojin's Reflect 2 from 2007, we can see an example of horizontal axis with symmetrical balance. The upper and lower halves of the work correspond precisely. Reflect 2 evokes a shoreline reflected in a still water surface. It was inspired by an experience the artist had as a university student while walking late one night along a river near her school. So perfectly did a tall tree join with its reflection that it seemed to be a gigantic tower floating through the air before her, perfect and eternal. She felt disoriented, lost in space, as in a dream. Kojin gave form to her vision by using fabric petals from artificial flowers, flattened and grouped and suspended by threads from the ceiling. Reflect 2 seems to float before us. The petal groupings are hung in depth, some further forward and some farther back, so that their relationships shift slightly as viewers move. The perfect symmetry of the whole revealing itself for a moment and then vanishing, just like Kojin's vision. This tiny sculpture is a shrine and was created for private devotion at home by its patron. It is a polypit, which means it has several panels, to either side of its central axis. These fold so that the shrine could travel with its owner. The central section and its figures of Mary and Jesus form the central axis, and the panels are symmetrically paired on each side. The work's symmetry is not absolute. The Christ child rests off-center on his mother's knee, for example, yet the work possesses symmetrical balance because the visual weight of the orb that Mary holds balances the child. The panels to either side of the axis also exhibit equal visual weight. Radial balance, with visual weight equally distributed around a center point, emphasizes that central point. Radial balance, with visual weight equally distributed around a central point, emphasizes that central point, such as we see in this mandala. A mandala is a diagram of a cosmic realm. The mandala here is a Tibetan Buddhist example, and it depicts the cosmic realm emanating from the female Buddha, who is shown seated in the centermost square. Everything radiates outward from her, including 4 more female Buddhas, deities of the cardinal points, north, south, east, and west, and other celestial beings. The work, therefore, has both symmetrical balance and radial balance. Symmetrical and radial balance convey a sense of stability. Symmetrical and radial balance convey a sense of stability. The placement of Mary and Christ at the center of the ivory tabernacle creates a forceful formal presence. Indeed, symmetrical balance is often used to express order, harmony, and authority, whether earthly or social or cosmic or spiritual order. Symmetrical and radial balance convey a sense of stability, as in this mandala. The word mandala means circle in Sanskrit, the ritual language of early South Asia, where both Buddhism and Hinduism began. For practitioners, a mandala serves to focus meditation on the goal of achieving enlightenment. The basic message of its clear geometry and symmetry is this: we are living in a universe that makes sense, even if its logic and order are hidden from us during our brief lifetimes. Much religious art uses symmetrical balance to convey similar messages. Mosaic balance de-emphasizes any single area. Another type of symmetrical balance is mosaic, also known as Christographic. Mosaic balance is based on repetition without hierarchy, as in the chestnut bud quilt made by Lucy Mingo. The image repeats its floral motif across 3 rows, 3 times in each row. Each panel of the quilt is identical, stitched together with pieces of black and white fabric. We are meant to see the flowers as a group. Inspired by the enslaved and free Black African American women who made quilts in the 19th century, Mingo is one of the quilters of Gee's Bend in rural Alabama. These women sew bold geometric quilts in patterns passed down through generations or newly created from an individual or collective inspiration. Balance can be achieved asymmetrically. Balance can be achieved with asymmetry, as is seen in this painting by Edward Degas, where we have 4 figures in the background which balance out the 2 figures in the foreground. The 4 figures visually balance the weight of the 2 foreground figures. Their darkened area of the dance studio has as much visual weight as the 2 foreground figure dancers in the lighted area, and the painting is thus asymmetrically balanced. Degas learned this technique from Japanese ink brush painting, such as this one by Sototasus, the Bird's Nest Patriarch, a daringly asymmetrical composition. The forms are placed so far to the left that they are barely on the page. The artist relies on an implied line of vision, both to balance the composition and to reveal its meaning. We naturally raise our eyes to look at the form of the priest sitting in the tree. That's all there is to look at. We then follow the direction of his gaze down. Nothing, just the flat surface of the unpainted paper. Meditation on emphasis is one of the exercises prescribed by Zen Buddhist meditation, which this ingenious painting presents clearly. Looking at the painting, we may feel tension and uneasiness in the empty void, and then repeatedly seek out the priest. He, in turn, sends us back to focus on nothingness. Much like the emptiness in Sotatsu's painting, Barbara Hepworth uses open space to create asymmetrical balance in her work Oval Sculpture. Contrasting the visual lightness and heaviness, made from molded plaster, the egg-shaped mass is round and heavy on one side. The area is solid, while the sculptor's other side is pierced with two large openings. We are invited to look into the negative space of the gently sloping lines. There is also another opening, a teardrop-shaped void opposite the solid end. Because this non-representational exists in 3 dimensions, we need to see it from all sides to truly appreciate it. Our experience of its visual balance changes if we view it from all sides. Standing before the solid end, we see only the heavy weight of a symmetrical oval. Any movement to the right or to the left reveals asymmetry and visual lightness. Asymmetrical balance can convey instability. Asymmetrical balance can convey instability. 3-dimensional forms are made of masses that occupy space. Emphasis in art draws attention to areas of the work, including the focal point. 3-dimensional forms and focal point. When we speak about focal point, we first need to speak about emphasis and subordination, which are complementary concepts. Emphasis means that our attention is drawn more to a certain part of a composition than to other parts of that composition. If the emphasis is on a relatively small, clearly defined area, we call this a focal point. Subordination means that certain areas of the composition are deliberately made less visually interesting so that other areas of the composition stand out or create an emphasis. This poster, designed by Erich Nietzsche in 1956, represents a glowing atom. Celestial constellations and waving lines that suggest the ocean's rhythmic movement or oscillation of sound waves. The poster was created as part of the General Dynamics Corporation campaign to help American audiences embrace scientific research that uses the atomic energy. The focal point is the atom, which appears like a nurturing sun rather than the potentially destructive force that threatens human existence during the Cold War. Its contrasting high-value colors and placement in the center of the image draw attention to the concentric circles and the warm glow. Conversely, the tertiary low-value colors and analogous color scheme of the constellations and oscillating waves subordinate their role in the composition. Together, the atom and its surroundings create a harmonious whole, with the atom playing a starring role in the universe. In the banjo lesson, Henry Oswald Tanner also used light, size, and placement to emphasize the figures of the old man and the young boy. Tanner set the pair in the foreground. They rest where light from 2 unseen sources meet. A window to the left illuminates the older man's side and the child's face, while the hearth to the right lights the child's fingers on the banjo frets. Tanner posed the pair so that their visual weights combined to form a single mast, the largest form in the painting. Surrounding the pair, Tanner used directional lines of sight to create a focal point on the circular body of the banjo and the boy's hand plucking its strings. Contrast also plays a role with the use of the boy's hands and the banjo. Tanner subordinates the background, blurring the details and working in a narrower range of light values. Imagine, for example, if one of the pictures depicted hanging on the far wall were to be painted in bright colors with much detail. It would jump out of the painting and steal the focus away from what Tanner wants us to notice. Francisco de Goya used some of the same strategies in Executions of the 3rd of May, 1808. Brightly illuminated colors, white, yellow, red, demand our attention by creating a dramatic area of emphasis against a background of earth tones and use of black. The man with the upraised arms draws our attention with his white shirt lit by a lamp resting on the ground. He is about to die. Those executed before him lie in pools of blood. The scene is set minimally as possible so that nothing detracts our attention from the terrible slaughter. A barren hillside, a ghostly view of Madrid, and darkness. the subordinated areas redirect our attention to the brutal scene. Emphasis is also a principle of design for architects who use position, color, and light to concentrate our attention. Entering this vast and mostly dark interior, our attention is drawn to the dome. At the center of the far wall, its glittering gold and colorful ornate designs lit up by windows. The dome emphasizes the most important location within the mosque, the Nehreb niche. During the service, Muslims face this niche to direct their prayers towards the holy site of Mecca. The builders of the great mosque in Cordoba offered the faithful a golden focal point filled with passages of sacred texts, geometric patterns, and flowery motifs. The symmetrical combination of round and pointed forms in the dome and the intersecting arcs below also grab our attention. Subordination de-emphasizes areas of the work that are not key to its purpose or meaning. Subordination de-emphasizes areas of the work that are not key to its purpose or meaning. Scale refers to relative size compared to real life. Scale and proportion both have to do with size. Scale means size in relation to a standard or quote-unquote normal size. Normal size is the size we expect something to be. For example, a model airplane is smaller in scale than a real airplane. A 10-pound prize-winning tomato at the county fair is a tomato on a large scale. We measure normal size based on our experience and prior knowledge. To guide viewers on understanding the size of a normal giraffe, Robert Jacob Gordon provided a measuring stick along the left side of his drawing. More importantly, he included a human figure to show that the normal size of the animal is very large. Viewers use this information to understand how big giraffes are compared to humans. Scale refers to relative size compared to real life. Altering scale changes the meaning of a work. Artists sometimes play with scale and our expectation of normal sizes. The sculpture of Ampine Colossus by Italian sculptor Guillaume Bellona shows us the effects that radical shifts in scale can produce. Many fairy tales and adventure stories tell of humans who find themselves in the land of giants. In this case, the giant figure is a personification of the Apennine mountain range that runs the length of the Italian peninsula, measuring over 35 feet tall. Even in a crouching position, the giant rests next to a fountain. His body is covered in jagged rocks, and his left hand holds a sea monster spewing water into the fountain below. Located on the forested grounds of a large country home, the giant delights us with his grand scale. Standing before this giant, we could feel our small scale and perhaps some anxiety at having our own small scale overthrown. Yet, this giant holds a secret. There are rooms inside, and we can climb around the interior of his massive body. Water, light, and perhaps even smoke once emerged from the figure, though today the Colossus rests quietly in his garden. Proportion refers to the relative size of parts compared to real life. Artists have developed different systems for the proportion of figures across time and cultures. Proportion refers to size relationships between parts of a whole, or between two or more items perceived as a unit. The proportions of each part of the giraffe's body in the drawing by Gordon are naturalistic. The head is in correct proportion to the size of the neck, the body, the legs, and the feet. The proportions of the giraffe generally match our knowledge of giraffes from the media and from visits to the zoo. Gordon's goal was to depict accurately the likeness of a giraffe, so he drew the proportions that he saw. Many artistic cultures have developed a fixed set of proportions for depicting a correct or perfect human form. Ancient Egyptian artists, for example, relied on a squared grid to govern the proportions of their figures. An unfinished funerary monument gives us a rare insight into their working methods, for in the finished works, the grid is no longer evident. Egyptian artists took the palm of the hand as a basic unit of measurement. Looking at the illustration, we can see that each palm or back of the hand occupies 1 square of the grid. A standing figure measures 18 units from the soles of the feet to the hairline, with the knee falling at horizontal 6, the elbow at horizontal 12, the chest at 14, and so on. The shoulders of a standing male here were 6 units wide, with a weight of about 2.5 units. Artists sometimes set aside natural scale or proportion for a more symbolic approach, or to express a hierarchical scale, such as is shown here, where the pharaoh's importance is highlighted because his size is actually larger than the rest of the figures. Among the many ideas from ancient Greece and Rome that were revived during the European Renaissance was the notion that numerical relationships held the key to beauty, and that the perfect human proportions reflected divine order. Leonardo da Vinci was only one of many artists to become fascinated with this idea. A Roman architect of the 1st century BCE, whose treatise on architecture was widely read during the Renaissance, and it related the perfect male form to the geometry of the square and the circle. Leonardo's figure stands inside a square defined by his height and the span of his arms, and a circle centered at his navel. The figure's proportions, however, are not natural. Scientific analysis has revealed that the human male body does not naturally fit well into a circle and a square. Leonardo's goal was human perfection, but his conceptual need to link humans and geometry ended up distorting the figure's proportions. The golden section is a method of organizing images thought to be appealing. A proportion that has fascinated many artists and architects since its discovery by the ancient Greeks is the ratio known as the golden section or golden mean. A golden section divides a length into 2 unequal segments in such a way that the smaller segment has the same ratio to the larger segment as the larger segment has to the whole. The ratio of the 2 segments works out as approximately 1 to 1.618 point. The golden section is more easily constructed than it is explained. In this figure, let's go through the steps. A square, its golden section, the golden rectangle, sequence of golden rectangles. A rectangle constructed using the proportions of the golden section is called a golden rectangle. One of the most interesting characteristics of the golden rectangle, as the figure shows, is that when a square is cut off from one end, the remaining shape is also a golden rectangle, a sequence that can be repeated endlessly and relates to such natural phenomena as the spiraling outward growth of a shell. Golden rectangles and their spirals appear in nature and art, and studies have shown that the human mind finds them appealing and attractive. Artists and architects use them as a rational yet subtle organizing principle as they decide where to locate a point of emphasis and how to proportion the parts of an image, or how to build the whole. In this example, the National Parks Preserve Wildlife, a poster created for the National Park Service during the Great Depression. It uses vertically oriented golden rectangles to create the relationship between the bighorn sheep and the landscape they occupy. The sheep are in the area of emphasis, and the point where the 2 meet falls within the tightest area of the spiral. The broader area of the spiral opens up to reveal the wide panorama of the mountains, lakes, and rocks. The result is an aesthetically pleasing organic composition that directs our attention to its most important point. Artists create real or implied rhythm through repetition. Rhythm in a work of art affects our perception of the whole work. Rhythm is based on repetition, and it is part of a basic part of the world that we find ourselves in. We speak of rhythm of the seasons, which reoccur in the same pattern every year, the rhythm of the cycles of the moon, the rhythm of the waves upon the shore. These natural rhythms measure out the passing of time, organizing our experience of it. To the extent that our arts take place in time, they too structure experience through rhythm. Music and dance are the most obvious examples. Poetry, which is recited or read over time, also uses rhythm for structure and expression. Looking at art takes time as well, and rhythm is one of the principles of design that artists use to structure our experience. Santiago Calatrava's monument sculpture Wave exhibits rhythm through its construction and its motion. The work is made of 129 bronze bars lined up side by side. This arrangement creates a sort of choppy rhythm when seen from the side. When the bars of this kinetic sculpture are set in motion, they rise and fall in sequence, and reminds us of the rhythm of the ocean waves that are constantly rising and falling. The rhythmic motion is reflected in the water below the sculpture and can be heard when the sculpture groans as it moves. Even in the still photograph, we can appreciate how the rising and falling structure our experience of looking at Calatrava's work. Even without motion, any of the visual elements can produce rhythm within a work through repetition, like the sailboat mast in this etching by Whistler. The line of the mast crosses the composition and continues with vertical lines created on the right by a dock post, and on the left by the smokestacks and the buildings on the shore. This choppy, continuous rhythm unifies the image, repeating like the bows of a jackhammer. Slight variations in the mast angles, only the center one is perfectly vertical, give variety to rhythm. Ansel Adams photograph The Tetons, Snake River, Grand Teton National Park, Wyoming, also has rhythm, but the artist did not create it. Instead, he chose to photograph a place that already had visual rhythm. The river in the foreground repeats a slow looping movement. It swoops to the left and then swings to the right before moving to the left again. Our viewers meander along this easy, soft rhythm. The mountains in the background, on the other hand, have a jagged type of a rhythm, like a piece of frenetic music. The quick and irregular alteration of the basic repeating unit of the peaks and valleys contrast with the smoothness of the river, adding variety to the photograph. And now moving into formal analysis of elements and principles. Formal analysis describes the use of visual elements and principles of design in a work of art. Andrea del Robina's glazed ceramic work, The Adoration of the Child, is 50 inches tall and 30 inches wide. Its side indicates that the scale of the 6 naturalistically proportioned figures, Mary, Jesus, and the 4 angels, are under life size. The bodies are white against a saturated shade of blue and 2 different values of green. Light values of green, blue, and yellow appear repeatedly alongside white throughout the arched frame, unifying the composition. The repetition of colors also creates variety and rhythm surrounding the focal point of Mary and Jesus. These 2 figures share an implied line of sight that bridges the asymmetrical balance created by the elongated mass of Mary's body and the diagonally placed Christ. The rest of the sculpture is symmetrical, with equal distribution of angels, bundled fruit, and God's hand holding a crown. Although the sculpture hangs on a wall, it exists in 3-dimensional space. Mary's hands project furthest, her head a little less, and her body eventually flattens into the 2-dimensional surface. Natural, rather than implied, light falls on Mary's projected head and hands. The light creates shadows that show us the linear drapery folds of Mary's robe, and the texture of the frame's leaves and architectural details. While these items are motionless, the gesturing Christ child and the hovering angels suggest movement and passage of time. Formal analysis can seem more challenging with non-representational art, yet works like the Asante or Akan cloth use the same vocabulary of visual elements and principles of design as Della Robbia's sculpture, but just in different ways. Without figures, our attention is first drawn to color, pattern, and balance. The cloth uses both repeating complementary and analogous colors to create unity. A dark value shade of red dominates the center, accompanied by a complementary green and analogous yellow. Lighter values of these hues frame the cloth at the top and the bottom. In both areas, the colors are woven in repeating linear patterns divided into rectangular blocks. The rhythmic pattern of the blocks, with thin vertical lines alternating with thick horizontal ones, is organized without hierarchy, in rows and columns, creating a crystallographic balance. Closer, we see that the thicker horizontal lines are not solid, but are patterned with a variety of checkerboards and rhomboid shapes. The small scale of the design and the varied detail invites us to approach the cloth and admire the fine weaving. We also need to consider that the cloth is not meant to be flat and still. We must imagine the cloth occupying real space and moving with its wearer's body. The subject of our third formal analysis may lack motion of its own, but it celebrates the beauty of space. The glass house, built by architect Philip Johnson in New Canaan, Connecticut, consists of little more than a rectangular volume of space contained within a glass and steel shell. The spaces of the outside and inside commingle, broken at the house's edges by vertical and horizontal lines of black steel. The space inside is interrupted by furniture and a cylindrical brick mass containing the home's bathroom. This brick element is located to one side, breaking the otherwise symmetrical balance established by the steel frame and concrete entry steps. Despite being built with untextured glass, the glass house nevertheless reveals many textures to us as we see the leaves, bark, and blades of grass through the windows. In the same way, the house's color palette changes as the seasons pass, marking time. The structure's unmoving lines frame nature's constant motion, and its intimate scale is overshadowed by the immense landscape that it honors. And this concludes Chapter 5.